Section 2 of Man Overboard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Man Overboard by F. Marion Crawford. Section 2. There wasn't anything to be done, with the ship hove to and the wheel lashed. If there was a man overboard, he must be in the water right alongside. I couldn't imagine how it could have happened. But I ran forward instinctively. I came upon the cook first, half dressed in his shirt and trousers, just as he had tumbled out of his bunk. He was jumping into the main rigging, evidently hoping to see the man, as if anyone could have seen anything on such a night, except the foam streaks on the black water, and now and then the curl of a breaking sea as it went away to leeward. Several of the men were peering over the rail into the dark. I caught the cook by the foot and asked who was gone. "It's Jim Benton," he shouted to me. "He's not aboard this ship." There was no doubt about that. Jim Benton was gone. And I knew in a flash that he had been taken off by that sea when we were setting the storm trysail. It was nearly half an hour since then. She had run like wild for a few minutes until we got her hove to, and no swimmer that ever swam could have lived as long as that in such a sea. The men knew it as well as I, but still they stared into the foam as if they had any chance of seeing the lost man. I let the cook get into the rigging and joined the men, and asked if they had made a thorough search on board, though I knew they had, and that it could not take long, for he wasn't on deck, and there was only the forecastle below. "That sea took him over, sir, as sure as you're born," said one of the men close beside me. "We had no boat that could have lived in that sea, of course, and we all knew it. I offered to put one over and let her drift astern 2 or 3 cables' lengths by a line, if the men thought they could haul me aboard again. But none of them would listen to that, and I should probably have been drowned if I had tried it, even with a life belt, for it was a breaking sea. Besides, they all knew as well as I did that the man could not be right in our wake. I don't know why I spoke again. "Jack Benton, are you there? Will you go if I will?" "No, sir," answered a voice, and that was all. By that time the old man was on deck, and I felt his hand on my shoulder rather roughly, as if he meant to shake me. "I'd reckoned you had more sense, Mr. Torkeldsen," he said. "God knows I would risk my ship to look for him, if it were any use, but he must have gone half an hour ago." He was a quiet man, and the men knew he was right, and that they had seen the last of Jim Benton when they were bending the trysail, if anybody had seen him then. The captain went below again, and for some time the men stood around Jack, quite near him, without saying anything, as sailors do when they are sorry for a man and can't help him. And then the watch below turned in again, and we were 3 on deck. Nobody can understand that there can be much consolation in a funeral unless he has felt that blank feeling there is when a man's gone overboard whom everybody likes. I suppose landsmen think it would be easier if they didn't have to bury their fathers and mothers and friends, but it wouldn't be. Somehow the funeral keeps up the idea of something beyond. You may believe in that something just the same, but a man who has gone in the dark, between 2 seas, without a cry, seems much more beyond reach than if he were still lying on his bed and had only just stopped breathing. Perhaps Jim Benton knew that, and wanted to come back to us. I don't know, and I am only telling you what happened, and you may think what you like. Jack stuck by the wheel that night until the watch was over. I don't know whether he slept afterwards, but when I came on deck 4 hours later, there he was again, in his oilskins, with his sou'wester over his eyes, staring into the binnacle. We saw that he would rather stand there, and we left him alone. Perhaps it was some consolation to him to get that ray of light when everything was so dark. It began to rain, too, as it can when a southerly gale is going to break up, and we got every bucket and tub on board and set them under the booms to catch the fresh water for washing our clothes. The rain made it very thick, and I went and stood under the lee of the staysail, looking out. I could tell that day was breaking, because the foam was whiter in the dark where the seas crested, and little by little the black rain grew gray and steamy, and I couldn't see the red glare of the port light on the water when she went off and rolled to leeward. The gale had moderated considerably, and in another hour we should be under way again. I was still standing there when Jack Benton came forward. He stood still a few minutes near me. The rain came down in a solid sheet, and I could see his wet beard and a corner of his cheek, too, gray in the dawn. Then he stooped down and began feeling under the anchor for his pipe. We had hardly shipped any water forward, and I suppose he had some way of tucking the pipe in, so that the rain hadn't floated it off. Presently he got on his legs again, and I saw that he had 2 pipes in his hand. One of them had belonged to his brother, and after looking at them a moment, I suppose he recognized his own, for he put it in his mouth, dripping with water. Then he looked at the other fully a minute without moving. When he had made up his mind, I suppose, he quietly chucked it over the lee rail, without even looking round to see whether I was watching him. I thought it was a pity, for it was a good wooden pipe, with a nickel ferrule, and somebody would have been glad to have it. But I didn't like to make any remark, for he had a right to do what he pleased with what had belonged to his dead brother. He blew the water out of his own pipe, and dried it against his jacket, putting his hand inside his oilskin. He filled it, standing under the lee of the foremast, got a light after wasting 2 or 3 matches, and turned the pipe upside down in his teeth, to keep the rain out of the bowl. I don't know why I noticed everything he did, and remember it now, but somehow I felt sorry for him, and I kept wondering whether there was anything I could say that would make him feel better. But I didn't think of anything, and as it was broad daylight, I went aft again, for I guessed that the old man would turn out before long and order the spanker set and the helm up. But he didn't turn out before 7 bells, just as the clouds broke and showed blue sky to leeward, the Frenchman's barometer, you used to call it. Some people don't seem to be so dead, when they are dead, as others are. Jim Benton was like that. He had been on my watch, and I couldn't get used to the idea that he wasn't about decks with me. I was always expecting to see him, and his brother was so exactly like him that I often felt as if I did see him and forgot he was dead, and made the mistake of calling Jack by his name, though I tried not to, because I knew it must hurt. If ever Jack had been the cheerful one of the 2, as I had always supposed he had been, he had changed very much, for he grew to be more silent than Jim had ever been. One fine afternoon I was sitting on the main hatch, overhauling the clockwork of the taffrail log, which hadn't been registering very well of late, and I had got the cook to bring me a coffee cup to hold the small screws as I took them out, and a saucer for the sperm oil I was going to use. I noticed that he didn't go away, but hung around without exactly watching what I was doing, as if he wanted to say something to me. I thought if it were worth much he would say it anyhow, so I didn't ask him questions. And sure enough, he began of his own accord before long. There was nobody on deck but the man at the wheel, and the other man away forward. "Mr. Torkeldsen," the cook began, and then stopped. I supposed he was going to ask me to let the watch break out a barrel of flour, or some salt horse. "Well, doctor?" I asked, as he didn't go on. "Well, Mr. Torkeldsen," he answered, "I somehow want to ask you whether you think I am giving satisfaction on this ship or not. So far as I know, you are, Doctor. I haven't heard any complaints from the fo'c's'le, and the captain has said nothing, and I think you know your business, and the cabin boy is bursting out of his clothes. That looks as if you are giving satisfaction. What makes you think you are not?" "I am not good at giving you what West Indies talk, and shan't try. But the doctor beat about the bush a while, and then he told me he thought the men were beginning to play tricks on him, and he didn't like it, and thought he hadn't deserved it, and would like his discharge at our next port. I told him he was a damned fool, of course, to begin with, and that men were more apt to try a joke with a chap they liked than with anybody they wanted to get rid of, unless it was a bad joke, like flooding his bunk or filling his boots with tar. But it wasn't that kind of practical joke. The doctor said that the men were trying to frighten him, and he didn't like it, and that they put things in his way that frightened him. So I told him he was a damned fool to be frightened anyway, and I wanted to know what things they put in his way. He gave me a queer answer. He said they were spoons and forks and odd plates, and a cup now and then, and such things. I set down the taffrail log on the bit of canvas I had put under it, and looked at the doctor. He was uneasy, and his eyes had a sort of hunted look, and his yellow face looked gray. He wasn't trying to make trouble. He was in trouble, so I asked him questions. He said he could count as well as anybody, and do sums without using his fingers, but that when he couldn't count any other way he did use his fingers, and it always came out the same. He said that when he and the cabin boy cleared up after the men's meals, there were more things to wash than he had given out. There'd be a fork more, or there'd be a spoon more, and sometimes there'd be a spoon and a fork, and there was always a plate more. It wasn't that he complained of that. Before poor Jim Benton was lost, they had a man more to feed, and his gear to wash up after meals, and that was in the contract, the doctor said. It would have been if there were 20 in the ship's company. But he didn't think it was right for the men to play tricks like that. He kept his things in good order, and he counted them, and he was responsible for them, and it wasn't right that the men should take more things than they needed when his back was turned, and just soil them and mix them up with their own, so as to make him think—" He stopped there, and looked at me, and I looked at him. I didn't know what he thought, but I began to guess. I wasn't going to humor any such nonsense as this, so I told him to speak to the men himself, and not come bothering me about such things. "Count the plates and forks and spoons before them when they sit down to table, and tell them that's all they'll get, and when they have finished, count the things again, and if the count isn't right, find out who did it. You know it must be one of them. You're not a green hand. You've been going to sea 10 or 11 years, and don't want any lesson about how to behave if the boys play a trick on you." "If I could catch him," said the cook, "I'd have a knife into him before he could say his prayers." Those West India men are always talking about knives, especially when they're badly frightened. I knew what he meant, and didn't ask him, but went on cleaning the brass cogwheels of the patent log and oiling the bearings with a feather. "Wouldn't it be better to wash it out with boiling water, sir?" asked the cook, in an insinuating tone. He knew that he had made a fool of himself, and was anxious to make it right again. I heard no more about the odd platter and gear for 2 or 3 days, but I thought about his story a good deal. The doctor evidently believed that Jim Benton had come back, though he didn't quite like to say so. His story had sounded silly enough on a bright afternoon, in fair weather, when the sun was on the water, and every rag was drawing in the breeze, and the sea looked as pleasant and harmless as a cat that has just eaten a canary. But when it was toward the end of the first watch, and the waning moon had not risen yet, and the water was like still oil, and the jibs hung down flat and helpless like the wings of a dead bird, it wasn't the same then. More than once I have started then, and looked round when a fish jumped, expecting to see a face sticking up out of the water with its eyes shut. I think we all felt something like that at the time. One afternoon we were putting a fresh service on the jib-sheet pennant. It wasn't my watch, but I was standing by looking on. Just then Jack Benton came up from below, and went to look for his pipe under the anchor. His face was hard and drawn, and his eyes were cold like steel balls. He hardly ever spoke now, but he did his duty as usual, and nobody had to complain of him, though we were all beginning to wonder how long his grief for his dead brother was going to last like that. I watched him as he crouched down and ran his hand into the hiding place for the pipe. When he stood up, he had 2 pipes in his hand. Now, I remembered very well seeing him throw one of those pipes away early in the morning after the gale, and it came to me now, and I didn't suppose he kept a stock of them under the anchor. I caught sight of his face, and it was greenish white, like the foam on shallow water, and he stood a long time looking at the 2 pipes. He wasn't looking to see which was his, for I wasn't 5 yards from him as he stood, and one of those pipes had been smoked that day, and was shiny where his hand had rubbed it, and the bone mouthpiece was chafed white where his teeth had bitten it. The other was water-logged. It was swelled and cracking with wet, and it looked to me as if there were a little green weed on it. Jack Benton turned his head rather stealthily as I looked away, and then he hid the thing in his trousers pocket, and went aft on the lee side, out of sight. The men had got the sheet pennant on a stretch to serve it, but I ducked under it and stood where I could see what Jack did, just under the forestaysail. He couldn't see me, and he was looking about for something. His hand shook as he picked up a bit of half-bent iron rod, about a foot long, that had been used for turning an eye-bolt, and had been left on the main-hatch. His hand shook as he got a piece of marline out of his pocket and made the water-logged pipe fast to the iron. He didn't mean it to get adrift, either, for he took his turns carefully, and hove them taut and then rode them so that they couldn't slip, and made the end fast with 2 half-hitches round the iron, and hitched it back on itself. Then he tried it with his hands, and looked up and down the deck furtively, and then quietly dropped the pipe and iron over the rail, so that I didn't even hear the splash. If anybody was playing tricks on board, they weren't meant for the cook. I asked some questions about Jack Benton, and one of the men told me he was off his feed, and hardly ate anything, and swallowed all the coffee he could lay his hands on, and had used up all his own tobacco, and had begun on what his brother had left. "The doctor says it ain't so, sir," said the man, looking at me shyly, as if he didn't expect to be believed. "The doctor says there's as much eaten from breakfast to breakfast as there was before Jim fell overboard, though there's a mouth less and another that eats nothing. I say it's the cabin boy that gets it. He's busting." I told him that if the cabin boy ate more than his share, he must work more than his share, so as to balance things. But the man laughed queerly, and looked at me again. "I only said that, sir, just like that. We all know it ain't so." "Well, how is it?" "How is it?" asked the man, half angry all at once. I don't know how it is, but there's a hand on board that's getting his whack along with us as regular as the bells." "Does he use tobacco?" I asked, meaning to laugh it out of him, but as I spoke I remembered the waterlogged pipe. "I guess he's using his own still," the man answered in a queer low voice. "Perhaps he'll take someone else's when his is all gone." It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. I remember, for just then the captain called to me to stand by the chronometer while he took his fore observation. Captain Hackstaff wasn't one of those old skippers who do everything themselves with a pocket watch, and keep the key of the chronometer in their waistcoat pocket, and won't tell the mate how far the dead reckoning is out. He was rather the other way, and I was glad of it, for he generally let me work the sights he took, and just ran his eye over my figures afterwards. I am bound to say his eye was pretty good, for he would pick out a mistake in a logarithm, or tell me that I had worked the equation of time with the wrong sign, before it seemed to me that he could have got as far as half the sum minus the altitude. He was always right, too, and besides, he knew a lot about iron ships and local deviation, and adjusting the compass, and all that sort of thing. I don't know how he came to be in command of a fore and aft schooner. He never talked about himself, and maybe he had just been mate on one of those big steel square riggers, and something had put him back. Perhaps he had been captain, and had got his ship aground, through no particular fault of his, and had to begin over again. Sometimes he talked just like you and me, and sometimes he would speak more like books do, or some of those Boston people I have heard. I don't know. We have all been shipmates now and then with men who have seen better days. Perhaps he had been in the Navy, but what makes me think he couldn't have been was that he was a thorough good seaman, a regular old windjammer, and understood sail, which those Navy chaps rarely do. Why, you and I have sailed with men before the mast who had their master's certificates in their pockets, English Board of Trade certificates, too, who could work a double altitude if you would lend them a sextant and give them a look at the chronometer, as well as many a man who commands a big square rigger. Navigation ain't everything, nor seamanship either. You've got to have it in you, if you mean to get there. I don't know how our captain heard that there was trouble forward. The cabin boy may have told him, or the men may have talked outside his door when they relieved the wheel at night. Anyhow, he got wind of it, and when he had got his sight that morning he had all hands aft, and gave them a lecture. It was just the kind of talk you might have expected from him. He said he hadn't any complaint to make, and that so far as he knew everybody on board was doing his duty, and that he was given to understand that the men got their whack, and were satisfied. He said his ship was never a hardship, and that he liked quiet, and that was the reason he didn't mean to have any nonsense, and the men might just as well understand that, too. We'd had a great misfortune, he said, and it was nobody's fault. We had lost a man we all liked and respected, and he felt that everybody in the ship ought to be sorry for the man's brother, who was left behind, and that it was rotten lubberly childishness, and unjust and unmanly and cowardly, to be playing schoolboy tricks with forks and spoons and pipes and that sort of gear. He said it had got to stop right now, and that was all, and the men might go forward. And so they did. It got worse after that, and the men watched the cook, and the cook watched the men, as if they were trying to catch each other. But I think everybody felt that there was something else. One evening, at supper time, I was on deck, and Jack came aft to relieve the wheel while the man who was steering got his supper. He hadn't got past the main hatch on the lee side when I heard a man running in slippers that slapped on the deck, and there was a sort of a yell, and I saw the colored cook going for Jack with a carving knife in his hand. I jumped to get between them, and Jack turned round short and put out his hand. I was too far to reach them, and the cook jabbed out with his knife. But the blade didn't get anywhere near Benton. The cook seemed to be jabbing it into the air again and again, at least 4 feet short of the mark. Then he dropped his right hand, and I saw the whites of his eyes in the dusk, and he reeled up against the pin rail and caught hold of a belaying pin with his left. I had reached him by that time, and grabbed hold of his knife hand and the other, too, for I thought he was going to use the pin. But Jack Benton was standing staring stupidly at him, as if he didn't understand. But instead the cook was holding on, because he couldn't stand, and his teeth were chattering, and he let go of the knife, and the point stuck into the deck. "He's crazy," said Jack Benton, and that was all he said, and he went aft. When he was gone, the cook began to come to, and he spoke quite low, near my ear. "There were 2 of them. So help me God, there were 2 of them. I don't know why I didn't take him by the collar and give him a good shaking, but I didn't. I just picked up the knife and gave it to him, and told him to go back to his galley, and not to make a fool of himself. You see, he hadn't struck at Jack, but at something he thought he saw, and I knew what it was, and I felt that same thing, like a lump of ice sliding down my back, that I felt that night when we were bending the trysail. When the men had seen him running aft, they jumped up after him, but they held off when they saw that I had caught him. By and by, the man who had spoken to me before told me what had happened. He was a stocky little chap, with a red head. "Well," he said, "there isn't much to tell. Jack Benton had been eating his supper with the rest of us. He always sits at the after corner of the table, on the port side. His brother used to sit at the end, next him. The doctor gave him a thundering big piece of pie to finish up with, and when he had finished he didn't stop for a smoke, but went off quick to relieve the wheel. Just as he had gone, the doctor came in from the galley, and when he saw Jack's empty plate, he stood stock still staring at it, and we all wondered what was the matter, till we looked at the plate. There were 2 forks in it, sir, lying side by side. Then the doctor grabbed his knife and flew up through the hatch like a rocket. The other fork was there, all right, Mr. Torkeldsen, for we all saw it and handled it, and we all had our own. That's all I know." I didn't feel that I wanted to laugh when he told me that story, but I hoped the old man wouldn't hear it, for I knew he wouldn't believe it, and no captain that ever sailed likes to have stories like that going round about his ship. It gives her a bad name. But that was all anybody ever saw, except the cook, and he isn't the first man who has thought he saw things without having any drink in him. I think, if the doctor had been weak in the head as he was afterwards, he might have done something foolish again, and there might have been serious trouble. But he didn't. Only 2 or 3 times I saw him looking at Jack Benton in a queer, scared way, and once I heard him talking to himself. "There's 2 of them. So help me God, there's 2 of them." End of section 2. Recording by Roger Moline.